Good evening. Welcome to tonight's event, Ealing's Postwar London, from Pimlico to the Blue Lamp. Tonight I'm very pleased to introduce Jenny Stewart. Jenny is a film historian she's lectured at Leicester University, but currently she's actually examining A-level students in Wales. But for the purposes tonight, what you need to know is she's written a PhD on bomb damage in films in 1940s films. Okay, little housekeeping. I'm going to introduce Jenny. She's going to talk for about 40 minutes. If you want to ask her questions, there's a chat facility at the top right of your screen. You'll see a speech bubble and you're able to type questions in there, and Jenny will endeavour to answer as many of them as possible afterwards. So, welcome, Jenny.
Thanks, Nikki. Thanks to Nikki and Susie and everyone at City of Westminster Library for putting this event on. I'm really excited that so many people are interested in this topic and that so many of you are here tonight. And as Nikki mentioned, a lot of this comes from my research for my PhD thesis, where I looked at depictions of post-war London in British fiction films of the 1940s and 1950s. So you're going to get a little taster of that tonight. When I'm going to focus on 3 Ealing films, which I'm sure most of you will be familiar with. They're 3 of their much loved films and 3 of my favourites, and that's Hue and Cry, Passport to Pimlico and The Blue Lamp. We'll probably spend more time on The Blue Lamp depending on how much time we've got, but what I was quite interested in is the ways in which the filmmakers at Ealing used the post-war landscape and used particular areas of inner London, why they used particular areas, and how I think these films are now kind of historical documents, because of course the London landscape, as we know, is constantly changing, and a lot of these sites and these buildings and even some of the streets just don't exist anymore, and it's great to have a record of them on film and in such lovely films as well. And I was quite interested in the ways in which Ealing kind of combined the aesthetics of the documentary tradition from the 1930s and of course with propaganda war films, and merged that with kind of commercial mass entertainment films of the 1940s. So that's kind of where my focus is going to be tonight. But first, a little bit of context just to set the scene. And what I'm going to do to start with is just play you a little bit of silent footage in the background. And this is just some stock footage from Pathé News of the bomb damage of the Blitz of 1941 and 44-45, just to give you a sense of how devastated areas of London were during the war. And the whole process of rebuilding was very slow because materials were scarce. Rationing, as we know, continued after the war. So the rebuilding and the kind of rebuilding in the kind of modernist style with the high-rise flats, etc., doesn't really get going until the 1950s. So straight after the war, London is full of bomb sites, you know, these kind of ruins, bomb damage, and I think it really sparked the imagination of filmmakers, but also novelists, painters, etc., because there's something incredibly powerful about these kinds of images and quite photogenic as well. And they serve as a reminder of the scars of war. But also we have to remember that, you know, London emerged beleaguerant, but also victorious as well. So we'll see how that resonates in the immediate post-war Ealing films. Okay, so I'll just move on. And some of the images from this period as well, particularly around the area of St. Paul's, which appears in quite a lot of these post-war London films as a symbol of resistance and sacrifice. So while St. Paul's did suffer some damage, it pretty much on the exterior remained intact. So it acquires a kind of new significance in the nation's mindset. So it becomes this really important symbol. And we see it repeated again by filmmakers because it's a recognisable landmark, but also what it represents about that sense of victory and resistance. And then just to contextualise a little bit about British cinema at this time. So many critics would argue that the 1940s was a real golden age of British cinema. We have major studios like Ealing and Gainsborough producing popular hits at this time. And we also see audiences reach a peak in 1946 in terms of admissions. And we also have a lot of the major studios are located in London or in outer London. So of course you've got Ealing, Elstree Studios, Rank Studios at Lime Grove and Shepherd's Bush, Riverside Studios at Hammersmith. So the British studios were located in London. So the filmmakers, the key personnel knew the city, knew the area as well. And we'll see how that sense of kind of familiarity comes through with the films. So of course the studio we're looking at tonight, the three films are all Ealing films, and an Ealing studio is having its kind of heyday under Chief Executive Michael Balcon from 1938 to 1958. And Ealing are probably best known for their comedy films, so over a third of films produced at Ealing were comedies and sold quite generically as comedy films, although we know that they did, they did other genres as well. And Richards and Algate say that, what kind of defines these films is this idea of people in recognisable situations that are plunged into extraordinary situations. And I think for all the films that we look at tonight, Hue and Cry, particularly Passport to Pimlico, that's certainly true. They're recognisable in their settings, but they're in these kind of extraordinary situations. And I think what makes them interesting as well is of course films had a quick turnaround at this time. So the turnaround between the film's production and release, I think, really ensures that they're really socially and culturally relevant to the period. And the key personnel at Ealing were mainly politically left-leaning middle-class males, such as notable names like Charles Crichton and Douglas Slocum. And most of the filmmakers at Ealing developed their craft in documentary filmmaking during the 1930s, and then of course propaganda films during World War II. And their kind of collective style and ethos contributes to what we might see as the kind of Ealing style, if you like, the idea of community, people coming together for the common good, use of realistic locations. And the films I think that I'm going to look at tonight really stem from this tradition in films like The Bells Go Down from 1943, that kind of drama documentary style that really they developed during World War II. So one of the key characteristics of Ealing Studios at this time in their post-war output really was their commitment to on-location shooting and creating films that critics really praised as being quite authentic in terms of the use of locations, as we'll see. So I looked at a range of Ealing films that were set in London and feature extensive location work in London. So lots of exterior shooting. So these are the ones that I looked at in my thesis. So you can see there, and I'm sure you'll recognise quite a lot of these titles. It'll be very familiar to you, and maybe at one point, I know we can only do 3 tonight, maybe at one point in the future we could have a follow-up and look at some more of other popular films like Lavender Hill Mob Pool of London and The Lady Killers, etc. And I think these films really, and the themes in these films really resonated with post-war audiences, and they really create a sense of a kind of village London, a kind of community ethos, and this notion of communities pulling together for the greater good. And we really see this in films like Hue and Cry and Passport to Pimlico. And this idea of the plucky, ordinary Londoner, you know, in these kinds of extraordinary situations. So 4 of these original London set stories, Hue and Cry, Passport to Pimlico, The Blue Lamp, and The Lavender Hill Mob, were penned by Ealing's most prolific screenwriter, T.E.B. Clarke. And he drew on his own experiences in London during the World War II, first as a journalist and also as a war reserve policeman. And we'll see how that feeds into the films that he wrote the scripts for. Okay. And Michael Balcon, the chief executive, really saw creating kind of realistic and recognisable films in terms of location as a key selling point for Ealing Studios films. He said, if you do well locally, you do well nationally. And he says, I believe that the Indigenous film is the truly international film. This, I suggest, is the reason for our success with stories of London and Londoners. He said, we know the heart and mind of the people. So the first post-war London film produced at Ealing is Hue and Cry, directed by Charles Crichton, 1947. So it's filmed during the summer of 1946. And the initial idea for the film came from the associate producer, Henry Cornelius, who then went on to direct Passport to Pimlico. And he imagined, the idea for the film came from the ending that he imagined in his head, where he said he imagined this, for 1 hour, a group of young boys have taken over London, and that sparked the idea for this film. And it was a financial and a critical success when it was released in February 1947, and really marks a kind of departure from the populist kind of comedy films of the war period, you know, the musical comedy star vehicles starring George Formby and Gracie Fields, and kind of heralds in a new realistic yet upbeat style of comedy for Ealing. And it's the first, why it's an interesting film to look at is it's the first post-war London set film to really make extensive use of the war-torn landscape. And I think this really spurs Ealing on to create more London set films. And if you've seen the film, you'll probably recognise some of the locations where it was shot: Wapping, Shadwell Basin, Covent Garden Market, the Holborn Viaduct. And the Holborn Viaduct, we see in a number of Ealing films, they particularly liked using that as a backdrop. So let's remind ourselves of the film just by having a look at the trailer.
So, you're the young fella that sees visions on the streets of London. What's your name?
Joe Kirby, sir.
That's right. Detective Inspector Ford's just been telling me about you. Started young, eh?
Started what, Governor?
The heebie-jeebies.
We reckon these stories are being used as a code by a gang of crooks.
You mean that my stories have been distorted by some...
Master criminal.
as a means of sending instructions to his, minion?
Without betraying his own identity.
Stupendous.
All this nonsense about crooks and codes.
But it ain't nonsense, Inspector. There's a racket being worked, really there is. Here's the code they're using.
You and the boys are going to catch them all red-handed.
That's the idea. Making a real big go of it.
The Battle of Ballard's Wharf.
Yeah.
Oh, how I loathe adventurous-minded boys.
that is, oh, I loathe adventurous-minded boys. Alistair Sim's fantastic in this film. Okay. Charles Crichton was keen that the film be as realistic as possible in its backdrop, because obviously the story itself isn't, and he said it just makes it a bit more kind of, if we put the boys in a world that's believable, that feels like their world, then audience is kind of more likely to go with the sort of fantasy of the story. So I think he really kind of drew on his documentary background when shooting this film, and he also stipulated that the film should have heavy use of exteriors. He said he wanted to use more conventional camera angles and born and bred London children, so the children have that kind of, they have a London accent, they don't sound like stage school kids. And he didn't want to use, or wanted to avoid as much as possible, back projection and studio trickery. And then writer T.B. Clarke said that this gave a kind of historical value to the picture, which I think it really does. And they said that they both wanted a what they called a sober old London that they both knew, and that they wanted to capture that with this film, and one that they said would appear logical to the average boy. So the climactic sequence, the Battle of Ballard's Wharf, which was a kind of bomb site at the time in Shadwell Basin, but they actually used a real warehouse for the climactic scene. Unfortunately, I can't get, it's hard to find clips of this scene online, but hopefully if you know the film, and I've just got some images there to remind you. And it's interesting, the Penguin Film Review of 1947, just some publicity stills. You can really see that emphasis on location there. So they found this old bombed out warehouse, and Crichton said, it had a kind of expressionistic quality that they thought was really, really interesting. And it does, it does give it that kind of, that sort of expressionistic style, the twisted stairways, etc. And he said that in the foreground, we could surround Joe with the distorted shapes of the warehouse and still leave him with a normal London background, sort of combining realism and kind of expressionism there. So some lovely kind of production stills, as you can see from these scenes. What we can have a look at the clip is where the children play, so their homes, and this really draws on the fact that a lot of children use bomb sites as kind of makeshift adventure playgrounds. And you'll see in this clip the character who makes the kind of war sound. So again, harking back to the war and how children played games, about the bombs coming down. So we'll just have a look at this.
No, why?
Oh, Royal, listen, I've been spinning a yarn about you.
I should worry.
Roy says they fetched a couple along to you.
Detective Inspector.
Detective Inspector, what happened?
Nothing much. Except he gave me a job.
You've got that great use of ruins and the bomb sites there, really kind of, again, it's incredibly kind of photogenic, and again has that kind of historical value, seeing all these sorts of images. And this portrayal of children as kind of heroic really stems from the writer T.B. Clarke's own experiences during the war. As a journalist, he actually spent time with children who fought fires and observed them playing in the streets. And he based the idea of the gang in the film are called the Blood and Thunder Gang, and they're based on a real group of kids called the Dead End Kids, who were working class kids from Wapping who helped fight fires in the Blitz. And he just thought that their spirit of working together and how kind of plucky and heroic they were, he wanted to kind of, you know, he wanted to imbue the Blood and Thunder Gang with that sense of working class children being heroic and coming together. And it really contrasts, I think, when we look at the Blue Lamp, where, you know, so children are resourceful and heroic and are able, as you saw there, children able to use and repurpose bomb sites as playgrounds, whereas teenagers were often seen as quite menacing and threatening. And of course, with the Blue Lamp, you have that kind of playing on that threat of the juvenile delinquency at that time. And even Charles Crichton was amazed at the young actors and how they used the environment when they were shooting. You know, he said that they just seemed to have no fear, you know, they just fling themselves off things, and he was impressed at just how kind of resourceful they were. So the film, as I said, was a critical success, and what's interesting is the ways in which the critics really focus on the use of location and really praise the film for giving it, you know, as the Washington Post say, that kind of air of reality. And that it feels like a London film, you know, that this is a film that feels like the filmmakers really know and love London. And we see this idea, you know, in the Evening Standard, they talk about a reminder that this ancient city has lost none of her beauty. And we see this in a lot of reviews of these Ealing London films. They keep talking about London as being incredibly beautiful, and that the filmmakers at Ealing were able to capture that and understood that. And this idea of the kind of young, plucky, resourceful, heroic gang of children, I think really contrasts to some of the European films at this time, particularly the Italian neo-realist films, which were much more kind of fatalistic. So you've got films like Bicycle Thieves and Germany Year Zero, where you've got the 12-year-old Edmund, you know, who, you know, ends up committing suicide. He jumps off the roof of a bombed out building. So much more kind of pessimistic. You're very different to that sense of, you know, being in England and being in London, and that sense of kind of victory and looking forward to the future. I think there's an interesting contrast there with these Italian neo-realist films. Okay. So the next film I just want to have a look at, of course, is the much loved Passport to Pimlico, which seems to have taken on a new resonance since Brexit, I think. But it's a film as well that really plays on people's memories of, you know, their recent memories of the war and the current situation in European cities. You know, there's references to the Berlin airlift, etc. And these are all kind of interwoven into the plot of the film. And it was the first feature-length film directed by Henry Cornelius at Ealing. As we know, he was a producer on Hue and Cry, an associate producer, but he'd also previously worked on propaganda shorts during World War II, and he also produced It Always Rains on Sunday, again another great kind of London film, but an East End film. And according to T.B. Clarke, it was Cornelius who decided that Passport to Pimlico should have that same kind of realistic treatment that Hue and Cry did in regards to location work. So again, let's just remind ourselves of Passport to Pimlico. Just see if I can get the clip to play. Why is that not playing? Hang on, let me try again. Sometimes it just sticks a bit. No, I don't think that's going to play. It was only the trailer anyway, so if you're familiar with the film, you'll. Oh no, here we go. It's working. Let's have a look at this.
You know whose crest this is? The Duke of Burgundy.
This charter specifically makes them natives of Burgundy.
You mean that these Londoners are technically Burgundians?
Indubitably.
Lord, I'm a foreigner. Only the Duke himself can appoint a council. But as there is no such person.
Ah, but you're wrong. There is such person. I am the Duke of Burgundy.
We have no power to negotiate.
Well, sir, I suggest you come back when you have. Legally, this is Burgundy. Head office no longer has any jurisdiction over this bank.
Russian books, this is Burgundy.
Coupon, this is Burgundy. Your export department. This is Burgundy.
Burgundy!
There we go. Unfortunately, the trailer doesn't show us much of the location work, but we'll see lots of pictures soon. So don't worry. So it's set in the fictional Miramont Place in Pimlico, although the exteriors were shot further south in Lambeth, and they just decided to set it in Pimlico so they could have that alliterative title. I think that was the only reason why they called it Pimlico, so they could call it Passport to Pimlico. So Passport to Pimlico, Lambeth at that time was an urban, residential area, and one that had really bared the scars of war. Over 4,000 homes were destroyed. 38,000 homes were damaged during the Blitz, and even Ealing mentioned the area in their publicity. They said it was a bare, ramshackle reminder of the Blitz. What's interesting about the location work, not only as a kind of historical document of Lambeth at that time, but also the fact that Ealing actually built a whole, what they called a location set in that area. So they actually built an entire set on an area of wasteland, and the sets comprised a hardware store, fishmongers, dress shop, bank, pub, etc. So it was constructed on an acre of bond wasteland that used to comprise Canterbury Place and Savile Place, just off the Lambeth roads. And Ealing was so proud of this that they actually used this in the publicity for the film. So they actually built the PR department built a scale model of the film set, which comprised all the houses and shops, as a publicity stunt. And it was actually displayed during the release of the film in South London cinemas, so audiences could marvel at the set. And it was built during the summer of 1948, which was looking at the documents from the time, a horrific summer. It was more like a winter. There was gales. It seemed to rain constantly. And as a result, the sets kept having to be repainted and replastered. So filming went on for longer than expected because of the inclement weather. So the location set was only supposed to stand for a few weeks, and it ended up staying up for 3 months, and I think it was dismantled in the November of that year, and as a result production went a bit behind schedule. Yeah, just a few notable locations there. You can see the Union Flag pub on Lambeth Road, and you can see it there underneath on where it appears in the film. And when we first see the opening of the film, we pan to this shot of the wasteland with the unexploded bomb, which of course is going to be important in the story. And the publicity department at Ealing suggests that people use it to talk about their most interesting bomb stories. And they put in the press book, experience has taught us that people are usually anxious to outdo each other with their experiences regarding unexploded bombs, and will talk about them on the slightest provocation. So throughout the film, though, this wasteland gets repurposed. It becomes an unofficial playground. So we see the children again, like in Hue and Cry, repurposing the bomb site as a playground. Then it becomes the site of buried treasure. It becomes a marketplace where black market goods flood into the area. You've got references to spivs and all that at that time. Becomes a scene of evacuation, of reservoir, a Lido, and then of course the street party at the end of the film where it's like, oh, we're back, and then of course it instantly starts raining. Okay, so the Ealing were very proud of this location set and were keen to describe it at length in their publicity for the film, and you can see there a lovely publicity still of the completed set. And they were really keen to show off how authentic the set looked. And in the press book they tell stories of how the locals thought the set was actually real. The labourers asked for work. You know, people stood outside the bank waiting for it to open. Obviously, how true these stories are, we don't know, but it's a good yarn to kind of promote the idea of authenticity with the locations. But Ealing did even go to the lengths of actually using local characters in Lambeth who were well known in the area for little small parts as extras. Including a Miss Polly Smith, who was described as one of the most familiar figures on London's Lambeth Walk. And it also, I think the set having it here provides that kind of, you know, the railway line is really important in the film, and it gives us that sense of a kind of nostalgic working class community with the pub, you know, the local pub, the railway bridge, all there kind of in the background. And this kind of nostalgia for almost like a pre-war Britain was also reflected in the architecture for the set. So they actually used for the set design buildings in a pre-war style, and it even led to local people complaining who thought it was real, saying, hang on, why are we building in this old-fashioned style? Why are we not building in the modern style now? I thought that was quite interesting. And this idea, going back to what Balcom was saying about the films have to be indigenous to be kind of, you know, saleable internationally. And this idea of it being a kind of, you know, a local London film was a key selling point for the American audience. So there were reports about when the film was screened at a cinema in Washington, DC, actual soil from Pimlico was flown in and put out in front of the cinema. And a London bobby would issue passports to the Americans as they stepped on British soil as they entered the cinema. Critics in particular, it's interesting how they saw this film as following on from films like Hue and Cry. Evening News said it had the same authenticity and genial observation as Hue and Cry. And Dilys Powell also said something similar. She compared it to Hue and Cry as well. She said it had the same delighted, affectionate invention in plot and situation. So I think Hue and Cry really kind of sets the mould for these sorts of London films to follow. But the most popular of all the London set films was, of course, The Blue Lamp, released in 1950. Again, another well-loved, popular Ealing film. And of course, you know, George Dixon in the film, you know, even though he dies in the film, is resurrected later on for his own TV show, The Dixon of Dock Green. And this is a film that really plays on, like I said, that kind of fear of juvenile delinquency at that time. And it was a really successful film. It was awarded the 1950 British Film Academy Award for Best Film. And it is also notable for being the first commercial feature film to be fully endorsed and supervised by the Metropolitan Police, because the Metropolitan Police had just developed their publicity department at this time, and they really saw film as a recruitment tool. So they were keen to work with filmmakers to try and get people to join the police force. So they wanted to create this kind of really positive image of the police at that time. And for Ealing, it made sense to do this kind of film at this time because of the popularity of kind of crime films, or what we might call film noirs now in America. And even some of the taglines for the film, like, you know, Scotland Yard at grips with post-war crime, you know, the unending battle of the city streets, really playing on that kind of popularity of those American films, the idea of the lawless metropolis, but now transported to, of course, to London. Okay, there's some lovely publicity stills from this film. This, by the way, apparently was this scene where he goes up to the children on the bomb site, was shot between Edgware Road and Hall Place, and apparently it's now a block of flats. So again, you know, that idea that these films have these really interesting historical images of these kind of lost places now. And I think as well, you know, as well as capitalising on the success of the American crime film, Ealing are also capitalising on the success of their own London set films and their drama documentary films made during World War II. So, you know, after the success of It Always Rains on Sunday, Hue and Cry, Passport to Pimlico, films that are all praised for their authentic evocations of post-war London, it seems savvy to make a film like this. So it has got quite an interesting production history, because it was originally meant to be made at Gainsborough Pictures. So it was John Reed and Ted Willis penned the original treatment for the Blue Lamp, and it was originally supposed to be set in the East End at Leman Street Station, and it was written very much as an East End film with East End dialogue. And it was meant to be incredibly realistic and have lots of exterior shooting in the East End. But unfortunately, Gainsborough were experiencing financial problems at this time, and they had to cancel a number of projects in 1949. And one of those was the Blue Lamp. So, of course, Michael Balcon seized the opportunity to take on the film and develop it at Ealing. For the reasons that I've mentioned, you know, it made business sense to do that, you know, and Ealing were ideally situated to make this kind of film. So the first thing Balcon did when he acquired the film, or the idea for the film, was to actually change the setting from Whitechapel to Paddington in West London. And the Met were originally, the Met Police were not happy about this, because I think they kind of got their heart set on it being an East End film. And Balcon entrusted T.B. Clarke to rewrite the script, and T.B. Clarke removed all traces of the East End dialogue in the film. And he seemed the natural choice to be scriptwriter, because he'd spent time as a War Reserve police officer in Hammersmith from 1939 to 1943. And Clarke recollected working on the beat on the streets of Hampstead, and kind of, you know, could bring that sense of realism and his own experiences into the script. So there's no records in the archive as to why Balcon changed from the East End to the West End, to being a West London film. But I think it's pretty obvious when you think about the narrative why it suits that. You know, you've got Soho nearby, the Edgware Road, the sense of the village London with Paddington Green, but the excitement of Soho, where you'd expect young people to be hanging out. So it kind of, I think it really met the demands of the narrative to move the location there. And historian Frank Mort describes Paddington at this period in time as what he calls a kind of twilight, or a transitional zone. He said it's squeezed between the established infrastructure of the metropolitan core and the settled residential communities of the Victorian inner suburbs, with dislocated communities including prostitutes and runaway teenagers. Let's just have a look quickly at the opening of the film that immediately create this sense of excitement and the lawless streets, but also that message that, you know, the police are there, the reassuring figure of the police. And you'll see some lovely footage of the Harrow Road.
To this man, until today, the crime wave was nothing but a newspaper headline. What stands between the ordinary public and this outbreak of crime? What protection has the man in the street against this armed threat to his life and property? At the Old Bailey, Mr. Justice Finnemore, in passing sentence for a crime of robbery with violence, gave this plain answer.
This is perhaps another illustration of the disaster caused by insufficient numbers of police. I have no doubt that one of the best preventives of crime is the regular uniformed police officer on the beat.
Veterans like George Dixon, with 25 years' service. Now Police Constable 693 attached to Paddington Green.
Excuse me, officer. Can you direct me to Paddington Station? Yes, sir. Straight across the green, turn left of the Iron Bridge and you're there. Thank you very much.
And young men, like Andy Mitchell, who has just completed his training.
Kid's lost, doesn't even know his own name.
No? Now look, Monty Green, you try this on again and you'll get into trouble. Go on, get off home. He knows he gets a jam band every time he's taken to the station.
So what's it going to do?
Never mind, Andy, there's one thing they couldn't teach you at Field House.
Yeah, I suppose not.
And it won't be the only thing either. You can bet your big boots on that.
Okay, so you've really got that idea, haven't you, of the local Bobby that knows everybody, you know, that's part of the community, and Paddington Green there as being this kind of, this sort of village London there, and you can really see there the real selling point for the Met, the fact it's got that voiceover, gives it that kind of documentary feel as well. So Ealing and the Met's dedication to this authenticity of locations is evidenced throughout the film, really. The interior shots of, even the interior shots of Paddington Green Station were based on photographs. There were studio sets, but they're actually based on real photographs of the real station, and Ealing made lots of visits there to try and recreate it as authentically as possible. But there's some other great location work if you know the film, such as the Coliseum Cinema, which was located next to Paddington Green Station, and that's where Riley commits the robbery and shoots Dixon. And these were shot at the exteriors at the cinema itself, with some studio work used for the foyer interior there. And of course the Coliseum was closed in 1958 and it was eventually demolished. And we also see images of the Metropolitan Music Hall in the film, which was demolished in 1963. And I think that just the fact that these places don't exist anymore, yet we see them here, really gives them a kind of historical resonance. So, oh yeah, by the way, this is located on the Harrow Road, opposite Paddington Hospital. So while the film focuses mainly on the work of the police, it also deals with the juvenile problem through the character of Tom Riley, played by Dirk Bogarde. So we see some lovely images of the West End, a place of excitement and transgression for post-war youth. a place of danger, of consumerism, of leisure, of disorder. So again, I think it makes sense why Balkan wanted to set the film here and away from the East End. So I just want to, I'm just aware that we're running out of time, so I've just wanted to show you some of the reviews of the film just to finish off with. And again, you can see there that focus on location, you know, the film being praised for, you know, saying it stars the streets of Paddington and daily life. You know, that's what they focused on with this film, was that sense of, you know, that use of the Harrow Road. They even called it the real villain, and even afterwards the streets were known as the Blue Lamp streets. And then Dilys Powell again praising the how Ealing captured the West End, the music hall in Edgware Road, the residential streets. She says, "I've barely seen a film which so vividly evoked London, not the London of the tourist, but the raw, smoky London, where this idea of a real London where people actually live." So just to sum up there, and there's a lovely publicity still from Passport to Pimlico. So I think all three films show that, you know, the aftermath of the war had this kind of striking visual presence that the filmmakers at Ealing used to their advantage, and also captured a London, and I keep saying this idea of authenticity that critics really loved about the films. And I think perhaps partly what we love about them today is that they capture these kinds of lost spaces, and London just in that period straight after the war and before rebuilding. And that Ealing's really drawing on the filmmakers' documentary backgrounds and bringing that into fiction films of this period. So I think they're really lovely historical documents. Okay, so I will stop talking, and you can find me on Twitter if you want to, if you don't get a chance to ask any questions now and you want to ask. I'll hand back to Nikki. I think we've got a few minutes for some questions.
Yeah, that was fantastic. I mean, I live in London. I live quite near where Passport to Pimlico was filmed, and obviously I've seen these films a million times each, but I still learnt so much. I think one quite interesting thing about the three areas that you describe is, while obviously they're very different, none of them have gentrified. They're still, you know, they're still kind of, Vauxhall is unlikely to gentrify anytime soon. People who know it will probably agree with that. And Paddington, while it's not cheap, it's still, Harrow Road, it's still quite similar in mix and everything. Although, of course, one thing that's sort of missing from the Blue Lamp, I think, is the immigrant experience. Perhaps 5 years later, it would have been a very different film. Okay, we have a lot of questions. But before the questions, I will just have a little plug for the rest of our programme. We have a lot of other talks coming up, so please check our Eventbrite pages. But I'll just mention one. On the 17th of March, we have Dr. Stephen Morgan talking about another aspect of Ealing Studios that was going on roughly at the same time as this, which was their films in Australia, which was pretty well contemporary with this and possibly less well known, but equally interesting. So that's the 17th of March. Okay, a few questions. Oh yeah, several people have said we want you to come back and do the Lady Killers and the Lavender Hill Mob. So that we'll fix a date for that. So don't worry, this will be sorted.
Do that.
And several people have asked, is your PhD available? What's it called, and is it available?
It is available on, if you go through the British Library, I think you can access it there. And it's called Depictions of Post-War London in British Fiction Film, 1946 to 1958. I did see if any publishers would be, I would like to turn this into a book. I've had a couple of publishers say, oh, I don't think many people would be interested in this. And I think the numbers tonight and your comments are proof that I think people are interested in this. So I will go back to the publishers with a nice little screenshot saying, People are interested.
I have a little screen cap. Yeah. I've
Yeah.
done a screen cap showing that there were 318 people at this event tonight, and plenty more will be watching the link afterwards. So I think that shows people are interested.
Yeah.
Okay, actual question, other questions. Okay, Helen asked, and I think probably the answer is you didn't see it, but Helen asked, did you see the Lucy Worsley programme about the Blitz spirit that was on BBC One last night? If I may say, it's worth watching because some of it was filmed in our Westminster's Archives Department. It was about the government's manipulation of images and stories to create the concept of what we now think of the plucky little Londoner. Do you think that Ealing Films contributed to this image?
I haven't seen the Lucy Worsley documentary yet because I was on a Zoom call doing film quizzes last night. So I will catch up with that on iPlayer. So thanks for that. Do I think they contributed? Well, I think they were so successful that I think they must have contributed to that idea of the kind of plucky Londoner. But I'd be interested to watch the documentary and compare the Ealing films to that. I mean, if you read my thesis, I expand quite a lot more on this in that I compare a lot of the footage in the Ealing films to documentary footage of the time and a lot of images of London in photojournalism, so in other kind of media forms, and comparing how Ealing kind of drew on these kinds of documentary traditions in these films. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Carol Lynch asked. Carol Lynch asks how easy it was to get permission to film back then. Was there more or less bureaucracy than there would be filmation? I mean.
Oh, that's a good question. I know for the Blue Lamp, the people who worked on the film all commented that they found it particularly easy to film on location because they were working with the Met Police. So that that cut a lot of red tape. So the Met Police gave them full permission to shoot, to close roads, to shoot where they wanted, because the police were there supervising, they were on set, and they also provided the filmmakers with a lot of the equipment they need. They provided them with the police cars, the radios, even some lighting equipment. So for that film in particular, that was pretty easy to shoot. I mean, for the other films, I didn't read anywhere that they found it particularly difficult. That didn't come through in any of the archives that I looked at. I think they found it. I think they found it okay. I mean, part of the reason they deliberately decided to shoot on location was because there was also a lack of studio space after the Second World War. So there were a number of reasons why they chose to shoot on locations, a number of kind of practical reasons as well.
Sheldon points out that the comic in Hue and Cry is called The Trump, which I've forgotten. Someone's pointed out that there's actually, if you delve around in the iPlayer, on the BBC iPlayer, there's, I think in the archives section of it, there's a 1970 documentary on Ealing comedies, which the anonymous person says it has a wonderful sense of layered history. The commentators note how different 1970 London looks when compared to the film footage in the 1940s, but of course 1970s London is now further away than the 70s was from the 40s. So that's worth looking. I think there's also an interview with Michael Balkan on the iPlayer. I seem to remember.
See, all this stuff comes out after I wrote the thesis. So at the time I was like scrabbling around for materials, and now suddenly there's quite a lot of stuff out, you know.
Not a question, but William Dudman has said, just wanted to mention that the BBC owned Ealing Studios from the 50s to the 90s. I worked there for many years, ending up as a film cameraman. One of my colleagues, Roy Gladish, was a child actor in Passport to Pimlico, and another colleague, Ken Westbury, was an assistant cameraman in Whiskey Galore. Well, William, if you want to get in touch with us to do a talk, that would be fantastic. Just drop us a line, because you've probably got some amazing stories.
And contact me as well, because
yes, absolutely. We can put you in contact with Jenny.
That would be great.
Please do contact us.
Yeah.
Dave Smith mentions It Always Rains on Sunday, which was just before these, which included many of the tropes later used in TV soap operas. Do you think this is overshadowed by the more popular Ealing films? And I think that's true, that people do seem to think that Ealing made comedies, and that's only a very small part of their output.
That's right. Yeah. I think It Always Rains on Sunday is perhaps gaining a bit more kind of resonance and recognition now in recent years. Like I've seen more. I think it's, I've seen more like work come out about the film. I think it's more well known now. And I think you're right. I mean, I do a chapter on this in the thesis as well, on It Always Rains on Sunday, and that kind of East End London, and it does feel like a precursor to EastEnders, absolutely.
Yeah. Sorry, I just lost it. Yes, there's lots of sort of comments where people have got very specific knowledge of the locations. Someone's pointed out, in case, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, there's a website called Real Streets. It's REEL Streets, which has a lot of before and after photos. So I'd really recommend that.
Yeah, that's a great site, and I mean, I had a look on it again today, and it's even developed from when I used it quite a lot in my thesis, just as initial, right, where is this shot, and then I could kind of work from there. But films like I was looking at The Blue Lamp and Hue and Cry, and people have taken, literally storyboarded the film, all the experience, at exactly where everything is. And so the site has really developed. It's a fantastic resource.
Nicholas Bennett points out that the shooting of the drayman that we saw in Blue Lamp's based on a real shooting of someone called Alec Antiquette trying to stop armed robbers in Tottenham Court Road in 1947.
Yes.
He also points out that Dirk Bogart's quite old to be a teenage hoodlum, but I think we all noticed that.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's, again, that gives that film that sense of realism, the fact that, you know, they did base it on a real story.
Yeah. There was a heated debate in the chat about how you pronounce Charles Crichton's name. I'm not sure how you pronounce it.
Oh,
I've always said Crichton, and that's what the consensus is, but you know.
Yeah, whatever.
We know who you mean.
Rubbish. Yeah, I'm rubbish with pronunciations, as you probably worked out. So yeah, don't know.
A couple of people have just said, why do you think these films have remained so popular?
For a number of reasons. I think they're enjoyable. They're so British. They're so British, aren't they? And I think, going back to what I was saying, I think they do have that historical value because of all this great location work. I mean, I'm one of those, when a film's shot on location, I'm the one often peering into the background, you know, where was that, you know, wow, look at how that looked at that period, at that time. And I'm fascinated about them from that perspective. But I just think they're still, and I think Passport to Pimlico, I mean, like I mentioned, and you saw in the trailer for the recent restoration of the film, you know, the fact that it's still a film that feels relevant today with Brexit, you know, I think they are films that still resonate.
You'll be glad to know someone's found the link to your thesis, so there will be people reading that, so that's excellent. I posted that in the chat. Someone, Andrew, has said, superb presentation, would definitely love a copy of your thesis. Well, Andrew, you can have that. He says, I was a police officer on duty all day to make sure the location footage of A Fish Called Wanda in Clerkenwell went without a hitch. And who directed A Fish Called Wanda? But Charles Crichton, of course.
Wow.
Former Chief Superintendent Jack Slipper of the Yard, organised it and had a company that liaised between the Met and film companies to facilitate locations in London and help with realism. And that Slipper wasn't he the Great Train Robbery guy? And he ended up organising location shoots. But anyway, that's very interesting. Someone says they like the Lego head behind you.
There's a lot of Lego. There's more downstairs. I'm a bit obsessed with it. So yeah. I've got
someone A cheeky
Going
little
back to what
plug
I say about
here.
cities, I should have done this downstairs with my Lego city backdrop to give that city feel, but maybe the next one.
A cheeky little plug here by the speaker next week. On the 3rd of March, we have a talk on Audrey Hepburn, and that does refer to the Lavender Hill mob, because she does a role in that. So tune in next week for more Ealing fun. Okay, I think we're going to round up now. The comments are still coming in. There's loads of praise, so you'll enjoy reading that. So thank you for that. Please book for any of our others, and keep an eye on our newsletters, because we will be having Jenny back in the autumn. So thank you, Jenny.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for your lovely comments and questions. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.